Okay, so welcome everybody. We have a handful of folks who are joining us on Zoom, and this is being sponsored by the Northside Planning Council, the Madison Area Community Land Trust, and the Northside Land Use Work Group. And we are doing a workshop tonight, a presentation on gentrification and land trusts. And so very fittingly, Olivia Williams, the Executive Director of the Madison Area Community Land Trust, is going to be doing a presentation. And we are excited to have her. She's actually a co-chair of our land use group and brings a huge knowledge base to the work. So it's been a real pleasure to get to collaborate. So I will hand it over to you, Olivia, and you can lead us from here.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here and to add a little to that introduction. I'll say that I got a PhD in urban geography in 2017 at Florida State University, and my real focus was on gentrification and strategies to mitigate the negative impacts of gentrification. And that's how I got interested in community land trusts, and I did my dissertation research on community land trusts. So I'll go into both a little bit about how gentrification happens, and then also policies, like some of which can encourage gentrification and some of which can help a little bit to mitigate gentrification. And then I will also talk a bit about strategies that community land trusts can use. So give me a second to share my screen. I think you're seeing it now, right? Okay. Gentrification, there's some kind of debate in scholarly circles about like if it's inevitable or not, and you might be able to say it's inevitable with capitalism. It's like as old as capitalistic cities. So some of the first big cycles of gentrification that have been recorded were in the mid-19th century in Vienna and Paris, where the gentry class started coming back into the inner city areas and replacing lower class who had moved to the outer rings. And then the term started being used in the post-World War II era in the 1950s when beatniks and artists in some US cities were trying to like be pioneers in the urban core, saw an opportunity to use warehouses or other kind of underutilized buildings. And then in the 1980s, we saw in the US especially, just a lot of kind of urban entrepreneurial activities, revitalization strategies, redevelopment that's like intentional and concentrated and facilitated by cities. And that's when we've seen just a lot of this pattern play out across a lot of cities and neighborhoods and a lot of attention towards it. So the characteristics, I mean, people define gentrification all kinds of ways. The ways that I like to define it are, you see a displacement of lower class people who might not be able to afford rent or property taxes if they own a house, changing characteristics of a neighborhood, as well as a replacement by a higher class population. And usually that comes with changes in racial demographics, which we'll talk about too. And then there's been some research about how this isn't just inevitable in every neighborhood. Reinvestment in street infrastructure by like city from the tax base really only starts happening in neighborhoods that are at least 35% white and no more than 40% Black. That's just based on one big research project, but kind of demonstrating racism in a lot of urban policy practices, but also that some neighborhoods, this demographic change doesn't hit a threshold where it becomes really threatening for displacement either. One of the big theories that kind of explains how gentrification happens is the rent gap theory from 1979. I'm hesitant to even mention the name of this guy who wrote this theory because he's an urban geographer who is like a very abusive guy and like has done a lot of terrible things to people I know, but He's dead now. But his theory, it's a complicated thing when you start, citing people who have done bad things. But this theory really does explain like a lot of how these patterns happen. So when there's neighborhoods that are falling into disrepair, at some point, pioneers realize the profitability and potential to start flipping homes and making money off of it. And then other people start taking notice that there's this kind of rational economic instinct or reason to start developing homes, redeveloping, or selling. So realtors, landlords, developers start taking note and becoming part of this process. And sometimes the city gets involved. And at some point, it's just irrational or kind of silly economically to not sell or redevelop a property. And then many urban policies can facilitate this process at a faster rate. And I'll talk pretty extensively about that in a bit. I want to put this alongside segregation because these are really two processes that are part of the same kind of system. So in segregation, communities of color, the reason segregation is so bad is really like lack of amenities and lack of access to resources that can happen in neighborhoods that are primarily people of color. Communities of color are more likely to have like a lack of access to transportation, fewer quality jobs nearby, fewer options for quality education, food deserts, and no grocery stores, fewer social amenities or even like places to hang out that are safe, or even like playgrounds, poor infrastructure, like sidewalks or roads, substandard housing, and often predatory landlords, organized crime, and then there's all kinds of problems with police. Sometimes people will say that they're under-policed in that like if they call the police because of a domestic violence situation or a situation where that seems like the right thing to do, the police might not come at all. Or there might be over-policed because the police see that as a place to like be tough on crime. But with gentrified neighborhoods, with an influx of whiter, higher income, higher educated residents, amenities come in, but those amenities tend to serve the white population at the expense of neighborhoods that don't have those things, and also eventually displacement of people of color is probable. Transit access and bike paths often come in. There are usually historic preservation measures start become like something that the city wants to do. You see better infrastructure and city services, entertainment and like hipster joints, cultural change, and then like division along cultural lines as well, like sometimes clashes. I'll give you an example of that in a couple slides. Displacement, sometimes place change names or name changes, and like a brand identity that's kind of like a changing demonstration of the cultural shift that's taking place. And then like different kind of policing starts happening sometimes too, where the police come to like protect the like incoming white residents who are at these entertainment destinations. And then again, like neighborhoods that might have an influx of a lot of these amenities, this happens in a concentrated way where other neighborhoods remain disinvested. So gentrification doesn't actually solve inequality or segregation problems, is kind of the point here. And these are two sides to the same coin. There's this very funny YouTube video, and I'm not gonna show you the thing right now because of time constraints, but it's like a mock Settlers of Catan advertisement, Settlers of Brooklyn, where they put like coffee shops and brunch spots and bike shops all over Brooklyn. And this came out, I remember it being very funny in like the mid-2000s when Brooklyn was quickly gentrifying. And I want to show you a few slides about that. So I have some quotes from some lovely rappers like Talib Kweli, who says, I lived a block away from Myrtle Avenue when it was called Murder Avenue. You didn't go there unless you had a reason. These are pictures of Myrtle Avenue. Now the reasons include coffee roasted on site or 14 varieties of homemade vegan nut milk at the Red Lantern. And kind of in the vein of the last slide, this is a quote from Spike Lee on the right. Why did it take this great influx of white people to get schools better? Why is there more police protection in Bed-Stuy and Harlem now? Why is the garbage getting picked up more regularly? We've been here. This is a picture of Franklin Avenue, which was once described as most deaf as an open-air drug market. And then this is Notorious B.I.G.'s apartment, which was on the market for $4,000 a month about 5 years ago, completely renovated. And Williamsburg is the neighborhood that's seen the most increase in rent. And this is kind of a whole list of different neighborhoods in New York and increases in rent between 1990 and 2014. Williamsburg saw a over 78% increase in rent in that time. And this is just one of the most extreme examples we can look to, but you'll see in Madison that we've seen not quite at that level, but pretty significant rent increases here as well that might get worse or likely to get worse. So we can kind of look to places like Brooklyn or other cities like Washington, DC or San Francisco, just to heed a warning of what is potentially possible here. And then there's cultural impacts from this too. So there was an article that came out, I think in 2014 about Spike Lee's parents who are, his father's a great jazz musician who has lived in Bed-Stuy since 1968. And white people called the cops on his father for playing bass too loud. And it's that sort of thing, that the cultural clashes that can happen that are really also just insensitive. So a lot of people ask, how do you have, or how could you get improvement without displacement? Because that's really the goal, is like, what if we want to be able to serve people? And integration is good too in a lot of ways. But like, how do we, is this just a one-way street, one-way trajectory? And the answer is this is really difficult within the norms of private property and just the way things operate. So land value is created socially, and private property kind of means that individual property owners benefit from value that's created collectively. So like in a neighborhood that has cultural amenities or cool things going on, maybe it's some kind of artist district, or you know, there's a lot of things that people like to do, that gets, that creates a property value increase for individuals, and individuals get to benefit from things that even people who might not live in that neighborhood are bringing to the neighborhood. And so that can be true also for things like transit, sidewalks, basic infrastructure, and property owners and developers take advantage of that value that's added by just people in a neighborhood, or public investment. And so when an area is getting more desirable, individuals and landlords see potential to get money. And then increases in property taxes pay into the city's general fund, but that can also displace low-income homeowners. So I know some of that was a little bit review, but basically it's really hard to stop this process from happening. So I want to go into some of the ways that city planners talk about equitable development. And this was a report, this equitable development report that came out in 2019 by City of Madison Planning Department, I think. And I'm going to share some maps that are really illuminating for some of the patterns going on here. And I'm sorry, it looks like a little bit blurry, but I think we'll get the gist. they mapped economic vulnerability based on income and home values and education levels and access to resources on this map. So the most vulnerable populations are in the darker blue here. They also mapped like the changing demographics of people of color. So they saw that overall, people of color increased, the percentage of the whole population of Madison increased, the percentage of people of color increased by 1.2% between 2000 and 2017. But in the downtown and east side, there was more of an increase in white people. In the south side and Park Street, there was a large decrease in the proportion of people of color. So there's like influx, there's already been severe gentrification on the south side and Park Street is basically what this is kind of showing. And then in the north side, there's been a higher concentration of people of color in that time frame so far. They also mapped household income. So around the Capitol Square, Monroe Street, there was the largest influx of household income. In Tenny Lapham and Atwood, there was also a large increase. There was even an increase in income along Sherman Avenue as well as the Park Street Avenue corridor. But on the East Town and Troy Drive areas, there were a little bit of decreases in household income in that time. So what that's kind of telling me when I'm looking at all of these things together is there was increased development along, especially downtown and along the Park Street corridors. And people of color have been moving eastward into the north side in particular. Then they mapped housing prices. So the areas with the darker areas have had the most increase in housing prices. So we're seeing increases along the north side, Sherman Avenue, that could accelerate even further. And we're seeing like areas that are kind of long gone, like very expensive towards the west side. And then the south side is kind of looking like the north side as well. And then they, based on all of this data and a few other sources, they kind of mapped like areas, stages of gentrification, if you think of it as like a trajectory. That the downtown area is pretty, it's appreciated. It's become very expensive. It's probably not going to get better anytime soon. The east side and kind of going into the north side is accelerating. So there's a lot of risk here for increased property values is basically what they were finding that could hurt communities of color that are already living in these areas. And so thinking about this at the same time as our affordable housing crisis, there's a real need for affordable housing in Madison. It's pretty severe at this point. In general, in the United States, we saw in the 2008 crisis, a vast transfer of single family homes to investors, like real estate investment trusts started buying foreclosed homes. And there's a high foreclosure rate also, especially for people of color. And now we see higher rents, absentee landlords, poor management practices, and a widening of the racial wealth gap, as well as fewer homeowners. That's since 2008, and that's also reflected in Madison. And then if we look at rental rates, in 2009, the median price for a one-bedroom apartment was about $700. In 2018, the median price for a one-bedroom apartment was about $1,150. So remember that percent rise in Williamsburg was like 78% over 20 years, but this is a 61% increase over 9 years. So that's pretty severe over the whole city. And And if rental rates just increased with inflation, it would have been about 17%. So Madison is about half renters, and over half of those are rent burdened, which means they're paying more than 30% of their income for housing. And about a quarter are severely rent burdened, paying more than 50% of their income for housing. So Madison really needs a strategic plan for affordable housing. And what we've seen are things like this equitable development plan or report, which I really appreciate and has some quality policy recommendations. I'll go over a couple of them. But we haven't seen like a real comprehensive strategy to change the dynamics that are coming and that we already know are coming. And it's looking like it's just getting worse. So these are some of the policies that I think are good and also are part of this equitable development report are basically finding more money for affordable housing through a housing levy tax, which adds to property taxes, developer extractions through impact or linkage fees, which are like, just puts another fee on a big developer that might be doing a luxury housing development or something. So you can take a piece of that, and it kind of disincentivizes that in a way and puts it towards the affordable housing fund that we already have. You could also do real estate transfer taxes, which can discourage like flipping houses and people who sell quickly, and put that into the affordable housing fund. All of these would be kind of incremental steps, like probably wouldn't make a humongous dent in what we're doing. There's another like thing that's mentioned in this report that I think would be beneficial in Madison, which is the community benefits agreement. For big developments that happen, like what might happen at the Oscar Mayer plant, a community benefit agreement would allow neighborhood residents to have a say in what's happening there about like what kinds of jobs are created. Are we creating living wage jobs? Are they doing local hiring? How much affordable housing are they putting in? And it's kind of like a labor union bargaining with an employer and how it kind of works. And to my knowledge, we haven't had any CBAs in Madison, though I know Milwaukee's had some success and they've been done in other cities with big developments. And usually this comes from a community push really wanting something like that. And at the same time, it's still not really community-led development. It's kind of a reactionary thing to do. So these are the kinds of things that we haven't done yet that we could do more of, and it still feels a little limited. One thing that the city has put money in the budget for is land banking. And basically it's a way for the city to strategically buy parcels of land and then either have a process for organizations or developers to apply to buy them, to develop something and to have rules about how they're developed, or to kind of know in advance what they want to have and what a developer wants to do and to like assemble parcels for them. We used to use land banking in the past in Madison, and it was something the city used along East Washington Avenue to assemble some of those parcels. But as we know, a lot of that is pretty upscale kind of development. So at this time, the city is creating land bank practices and procedures. Just so you know, I'm not looking at the chat, so if there's anything I need to know, please tell me.
I'm watching the chat for you, Olivia.
Thank you. But there are a few ways that as the city develops land bank policies, they could have an eye towards kind of buying land in areas that is not yet extremely expensive and making sure we have community-based institutions that the neighborhoods want to have in those places, and working with nonprofits or community groups to make sure those get developed in the ways they need to. And so they could consider requiring affordability restrictions on land banked land, they could consider a direct link between a land bank and a community land trust. And this is something that cities like Houston and Richmond have done because they see the value in permanent affordability. Yeah, those are. Yeah.
Can you talk a minute about, like, just kind of on a macro level, like what land banking is?
Yeah, it's basically the city having money to buy land to fulfill their goals, and their goal that can be very, very broad. So land banking can really aid gentrifying development, or it can be intended for community benefit, basically. But it's just the city buying land and then like selling it again or giving it to a developer or nonprofit. Some land banks are specifically used in cities where they've had a lot of blight and empty buildings, and they land bank in order to just tear down buildings that are dangerous, and then they just have empty land that they need to get rid of. That's not really a problem in Madison right now. So we're kind of using the land bank more to strategically develop. I've also done lots of dreaming about cool policies that we could have in Madison, and lots of times I've only lived here about 2.5 years, so lots of times I've said things like, oh, we should have inclusionary zoning or like something on this list, and you know, it's like, oh, there's a state preemption law for that. So the Republicans last few years have done a number on our state laws that prohibit municipalities from doing lots of cool things. So there's a lot of potential to change state law to do bigger sweeping changes that could help prevent displacement. So we could have better eviction prevention laws and protection laws. We could have property tax relief to limited income homeowners. This is something Abha and I briefly talked about the other day, and then I realized there was a state preemption law for that. We could have rent control to cap rent increases to be something like 5% a year max, which there is no cap like that. Landlords can kind of increase rent as they want. We could have inclusionary zoning that makes any new big development have a certain percentage of units allocated as affordable. That's illegal right now. We could have a tenant and or a community option to purchase act. Like in Washington, DC, there's a tenant option to purchase, which means that when a building comes up for sale, even a single family home or an apartment building that could become a cooperative, the landlord has to tell the residents, the tenants, that they have the right of first refusal. So this is how Washington, DC has developed a lot of co-ops, limited equity cooperatives. San Francisco recently passed a community option to purchase act, which has a similar thing in mind, but it also adds a list of nonprofit affordable housing organizations to that kind of list of who has a right of first refusal. And then the whole state of California just passed a law where this was like a kind of COVID response law where it allows for a right of first refusal basically for any bank foreclosed property that's between 1 and 4 units of residential units. So that means that they're trying to stop real estate investment trusts or big investor companies from buying rental properties and raising rents, like what happened in the 2008 crisis. So we'll see if that has a big impact. Still, buying at market rate is really hard for either tenants in a building or for organizations. So it'll be interesting to see what comes of that. But I believe even that one would also have to go to a state law thing change in Madison or in Wisconsin. So like I have been saying, cities often have revitalization strategies, some of which can help, but a lot of them kind of encourage gentrification. So one of my urban geography kind of colleagues, Sam Stein, has written a lot about how zoning, we have lots of fights about zoning, like we should up zone, meaning increasing density, or we should down zone, meaning we should not allow like big buildings to come in, or we should eliminate single family housing zoning, you know, regulations, or whatever it is. None of those zoning changes have been shown to really stabilize housing values, because any of them basically allow for developers to take advantage in some way or another, or for property values to go up. And so when we're kind of confined to arguing about zoning, we're just like bickering about little things where like the whole system in place is allowing the perpetuation of a problem. So that's one issue. It's just a challenge given the limits of what the city has power to do, especially in Wisconsin. One thing that even the city of yeah?
Olivia, can you speak to, I'm curious about the mechanics behind how eliminating single family zoning could lead to increased rent?
Well, just think that means that any developer could buy a few houses next to each other and build a big luxury housing complex.
Okay.
And then even adding, it seems counterintuitive because you're adding units to the whole. So you would think, like, based on supply and demand, if there's more demand for housing, having more supply means it probably would bring all the prices down.
Right.
But it's not, it doesn't actually work like that, which is sad because land is a fixed resource. So we can't just create more land all the time. And so that means that housing markets are just really confusing when you start thinking about them as like in a traditional economic sense. And so when you add kind of market rate or luxury housing, it can actually bring prices up, which is a little counterintuitive.
Yeah, no, thank you. It's good to reframe that around like land is finite, right? And that, right. So thank you. That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think zoning is, it's one tool we can use to implement a plan if there's a community plan or a city-based plan, that's good. But I remember Justice said this in his talk last month, that zoning it needs to be done in collaboration with some other like financial tools or funding tools or a community benefits agreement or whatever it is that's gonna help push something towards the right kind of development, because otherwise it could just be very expensive. And I'll go into, in my next few slides, I'll talk about tax increment financing and opportunity zones, which are implemented here in Madison, which they have kind of mixed results. Opportunity zones are especially bad a lot of the time. So you hear a lot of planner types and housing people talk about tax increment financing, or TIF. And so this is something that most cities do to encourage development. And Madison has some TIF districts that I'll show you next. But the way the policy works is they pick an area and they say, okay, whatever property taxes we've been bringing in here, we're gonna only bring in this amount for the next like 20 years. We're just gonna cap it right here, and these taxes will keep coming to the city. And whatever increase happens, like you see on this slide in the green, the incremental increase, we're gonna set aside to just pay for improvements in this district. And so the city comes up with their own like rules about what that can go towards, but usually they give loans to new developers to build big mixed use buildings. So some of those downtown, like big new developments were paid for with TIF money in Madison, for example, or I think even along the Washington Avenue corridor. This is an area I'm like less of an expert in on the particularities of the Madison TIF districts and what they've been used for, but basically the increase goes to that district, and some of it can be used for affordable housing, but the whole goal of this whole thing is to increase property values, to increase property taxes. So at the end of the period, this 20 years or however long they set it for, then you have all the taxes come back to the city, and that's, you know, yay. This map is a little bit ugly to look at, but the bright colors of yellow, pink, bright green, and then kind of baby blue way on the west side, those are the existing TIF districts right now. And I have another ugly map. I just gave you both of them because they're both bad, but bad in different ways. This just kind of shows them, so it's like a little easier to pick out where they are. So these are the areas the city has designated for this kind of policy. So developers in those places can apply for TIF like incentive money to help with their development. In Madison, we've also had some old TIF districts that closed, like their period of withholding taxes for this purpose has ended. And we've been able to take advantage of a newer state law that says we could extend that period 1 year and have all of that increment, which it's a lot by the end of that time, all of it can go to the Affordable Housing Fund, which now nonprofits can apply for housing development, affordable housing. So that's cool. Look at these numbers. In TIF District 43, just south of Regent, it was created in 2013. The value, I think this is like the property value of everything there, was like 25 million. And then 5 years later, it was 66 million. So the value went up significantly in that area, and they were able to use a little bit of it for affordable housing, but now that whole area is really expensive. So this is kind of how TIF works overall. Madison is a progressive city with progressive TIF goals. So we say, like, we can't use these funds for luxury housing or student housing or speculative office space. These are like literally written into the policy. And 10% of it can be used for affordable housing developments. And then we have that final year period where we can use the whole thing for affordable housing fund. But the whole goal is growing the property tax base and revitalization, which is basically another word for gentrification. And also urban infill, so doing this redevelopment in a space that's already urban instead of suburban or new build areas. Enhancing the development potential of an area, so encouraging more development here, and then adding public infrastructure. So TIF districts often are put in places that might already be gentrifying, but the way they're supposed to work is they're supposed to encourage revitalization. Yeah.
Olivia, can you kind of, again, I think that this whole idea of a TIF district isn't very intuitive, right? So like, what does it actually functionally look like? How does it work?
So you take an area that has not had a lot of new development, and you whatever taxes are coming in right now from that district, property taxes, the city just says, we're just going to take this much for our general fund for the next 20 or 30 years. And then we'll allocate whatever comes in on top of that for improvements here, just here. So part of the problem with this is it siphons funds away from the general fund, which might go to schools or libraries or other things that the whole city of Madison might use. And for that 20 or 30 years, the increase in property taxes just stays right there.
So essentially, if I could just add, so the city essentially contributes to an improvement on a property through the general fund, right? So it gives a developer $7 million, let's say, or $5 million for the development. And then the idea is because the property taxes are going to increase because of the improvement, the city will recoup that and more. Is that how it works?
Yeah, and it's usually with like some kind of loan and bond or something. It depends on how different
Sure.
cities do it different ways. Yeah.
Right. And ours, like, for example, like the Madison Public Market is actually, the city's contribution to that is actually coming out of the revenue generated from the TIF district there, which probably had to do with some of the high-rise development on West Washington. I'm sorry, on East Washington, and and so, for example, let's say a developer was able to get funds from the city in order to build that improvement. And then because of that, the property taxes went up. And so suddenly the city's general fund was getting a lot more income. And then they designated that for improvements, other improvements in that same district. And in this case, it's going to be going towards the Madison Public Market.
That's cool. So
Yeah.
I think the city of Madison in general uses it for good reason. And I'm not saying TIF is bad. I think it's one of the biggest tools we have here to add money to affordable housing or things like the public market. But the whole kind of, I get frustrated as like a systems thinker for like, this is the system we're given, that the best tool we have is one that is supposed to increase property values overall. And so it like gentrifies an area to give a little slice to something good.
Exactly.
And that's considered like one of the best tools we have. And that's really sad.
Right. No, and I only use that as an example, a concrete example of how a TIF district works. But I agree that it's problematic because the flip side of that is the gentrification that probably displaced a lot of people. So while we may be building a public market, which we are fully supportive of, which will, create entrepreneurial opportunities for lots of folks, for example, is that economic impact worth the trade-off of the displaced people, in that same district because of the gentrification? And so these are all the questions that we have to grapple with when we choose policies like this.
Yeah, totally. And as a nerd, I would really love to see some research on that exact question of the trade-offs. And it might exist, and if anyone knows, like, please send it to me. And I'll just mention this one briefly because it may not be very impactful in Madison, but opportunity zones are basically the Trump administration's kind of community development policy. So it's a HUD level thing that the city of Madison is doing. And they designated these districts, which you notice are the ones that are at risk of gentrification, as areas where investor groups can come in and do a development and get a really big tax break if they make a certain return on their investment. And they have to apply to become a like qualified opportunity zone fund or something. And one of the city committees told me there's only been 2 of them so far that have done this and been approved. And so they believed that it wouldn't be very impactful because they haven't seen a lot of investor groups applying to do this. But this whole kind of policy was basically created to incentivize urban revitalization, redevelopment by investor groups who have money to do that. And it specifically incentivizes like a really high rate of return, meaning going into areas where you can buy cheap and develop cheap and then develop something that has high rents and is expensive, and therefore you get a high rate of return. And then on top of that, you get a tax break. So it's a little bit annoying to say the least that the city of Madison even like implemented this policy because they didn't have to, but they did, and so it's there. At kind of the big national level, a lot of people say this policy like may not have a huge impact because it's not a well thought out policy, even from the investor perspective. And so that's, again, why it may not have a big impact, but
This is an interesting question. We're looking at the map. So we have two development proposals that are sort of, they may be a little stuck right now, but one of them is the Ramish Farm on North Sherman, and the other is the Annex, which is at Wheeler and CV. They appear to be within this opportunity zone, don't they? Just based on this map. What kind of implications would that have? Just that it would be, it would be incentivized by tax credits. Does that sound right?
Yes, but only if they apply to be a like qualified opportunity investment group, or I forget the specific term for it, but there's a whole particular process they have to do to even qualify for the tax break. And so most developers may not do that, but they would probably look into whether it's worth it and then decide, especially if it's a big development.
Okay, yeah, thanks.
There are, I linked here this, and I know you don't have the slides, but I could share them. There's a group called SAGE that created an opportunity zone guide, and you could even Google SAJE and opportunity zones and you could find it. But they kind of outline why this is so bad and like ways to resist it or create counter policies. And there was another guide by, I think it was Policy Link, that I'm kind of drawing from both of them to say that there are some ways that we could try to like resist or create kind of requirements for what happens in opportunity zones. I'm not 100% sure how much of these recommendations can be legal here. Like, I'm not sure how much you can require a development. Like, you can't do inclusionary zoning, for example. So you can't require it have affordable housing. But there might be a few things that the community could kind of request, like a code of conduct to make sure that the community has like a community benefits agreement, for example. That could be something people could advocate for. And monitoring like living wage jobs, affordable housing units created, investments in businesses owned by people of color. And then a few groups have even talked about ways to create like a community controlled opportunity fund. But like I said before, the requirement that you get a very large return on your investment probably means it's hard to do the right thing. If you get what I mean. So that's all I want to say about that. But this slide is really just to note that more than 70% of the city's general fund revenues come from property taxes. So this is why everyone at the city like really wants their property taxes to go up. And this chart shows how property taxes have gone up over time and like percentage of increase each year. And I was reading about how right now with the COVID crisis, a lot of the other sources of tax revenue like hotel taxes and things like that have gone down a lot. So that's why there's a lot of fear about next year's budget and whatnot, but property taxes have gone up. So that's why they rely on property taxes so much, even now. So now I'll get into community land trusts. I always get a little hoarse when I present for a long time.
Maybe, Olivia, before we transition, we actually
Yeah.
do have some questions related to the first part of this that might be good to address right now. So
that's a good idea.
One question Sheena was asking, so you know, just a clarifying question, so that in regard to land banking, is that the city will bank land as a part of their process, and whether or not it's intended for community use could be something we weigh in on?
Yes, I don't know how the process will work, like at what point community will weigh in or could, because it's not, I think that's a question up in the air of like how and when.
Okay.
Yeah.
And maybe that's something that we can weigh in on then, right? Like, and make sure that you know, we're advocating for the appropriate amount of community input into those purchases and use.
Totally.
And then Lori was asking, what do you anticipate some of the impacts on housing will be when the city of Madison finishes annexing the town of Madison?
You know, I don't really know a whole lot about how that'll impact much. I do know that they are creating a TIF district there to help with that process and to help with investment in city streets and other infrastructure that's needed there. And so that, I would guess, would increase development potential and prices in that area.
Okay, great. And then another question in Facebook was, let's see, can you ask about forming a real estate investment trust with intent to simply hold properties for the community purposes as opposed to making money off the renters? Is that essentially what we mean by a land trust? Yeah.
It's actually different than a land trust, so I'll talk about it at the end.
Oh, great, good. And then another question from Facebook. I don't know that you would have resources on this, but asking where do we learn about the small business and minority business funds that are supposed to be attached to opportunity zones?
I don't know.
Yeah.
I would ask city staff about exactly what's already happened here, and then if you're thinking, I'm not sure if I totally got the question, but if you're thinking about like resources for how to do something cooler, the Policy Link and Sage both have guides on opportunity zones.
Opportunity zones. Yeah, I think, Tara, I think for that question, I would contact the Economic Development Department at the city, Economic Development Division at the city, because I have heard their staff talking about opportunity zones, and they might have some resources for you. Okay, I think I got all the questions in the chat, and why don't we let you continue? Thanks.
Cool, thanks. And I may end up skipping a few of these slides coming up just to save my own voice. This is always my problem teaching, and I had to break things up and do like activities so that I didn't go hoarse. But community land trusts are nonprofit organizations that treat land as a public good. So they're not really investment trusts in the same way, and I'll get to that kind of difference at the end. But community land trusts are nonprofits, and they own land and work to ensure that it's used in ways that benefit the community. And this can be through affordable housing, or gardens, or commercial space, or community centers, or any kind of number of uses. But buildings are typically owned and used by organizations, businesses, and individuals on the land. There are about 300 community land trusts in the US and Canada. The blue ones here are in the US, and the pinker ones are in Canada. And there are about 170 community land trusts in the UK. This is kind of our second most populous country with community land trust. However, UK has a very high density of community land trust comparatively, and they have significantly invested in community land trusts as a strategy for social housing. So they have a one-up on us in terms of like federal policy that supports community land trusts. There are about 20 in France, there are a handful in Belgium, and this is the world map. So They're being utilized in the global south in a couple situations, particularly for like favelas in Brazil. So informal kind of settlements becoming a little more formalized and protected through community ownership and a land trust. In Madison, our community land trust was founded in 1990, and we have 69 homes now, and this is a map of where those are. We primarily do single family home ownership, though we could expand to experiment with different models. We do have 10 units that are market rate at Troy Gardens, but we own the land under all of Troy Gardens. And we also have a development at Camino del Sol of like a few houses, as well as Anniversary Court on the far east side. So we've done development of a few enclaves of houses, as well as some scatter site around Madison. And 1/3 to 1/2 of our board is always residents who live in our houses. We also own 26 acres of non-housing land at Troy Gardens, which Rooted manages as a community farm, restored prairie, and community gardens. And so briefly, how the home ownership model works is we own the land under the house and someone buys the land, the house only. And so that reduces the cost, the mortgage that they're getting. And then they pay a small lease fee to us of $50 to $75 a month. They also have reduced property taxes. And then we retain permanent ownership of the land. And every time they resell the house, when they want to sell it, we make sure it's sold to someone low income. For us, that's usually between 60% of the median to 80% of the median of this area. So kind of moderately low income people who can afford to get a mortgage, but may not be able to afford like full home ownership. And we also make sure that they sell it at a price that's what they bought it for, plus 25% of the increase in value from the time that they bought it. So that means they get to save their equity that they've invested into their mortgage with a little bit of a return on their investment, while the house itself gets more affordable over time compared to houses around it. So instead of that kind of individual property ownership only model, it's a shared equity model that allows for kind of community stabilization and community benefit rather than always increasing values. It's an opportunity for home ownership, but that home ownership is more of like a stable place to live. It's emphasizing like the use value over the investment value. People have autonomy over their home rather than renting. And then another important piece here is it reduces the risk of foreclosure by a factor of 10, according to research done in 2010 after the foreclosure crisis, where across the United States, the conventional ownership foreclosure rate was 4.63%, and in CLTs it was less than 0.5%. So even though these are like low income people, they're kind of protected from foreclosure a lot of the time within CLTs. This is a wordy slide, I apologize, but briefly, you know, in the US, home ownership has been seen as this investment tool, this great way to build individual wealth and to pass it to your family members when you die. And in the 2000s, we saw more home ownership than any other point in US history. But this has primarily been a tool of white supremacy, where that's how white people have been able to have a lot of wealth and pass it down over generations. And we see this great wealth gap between races. And even in the 2008 crisis, a lot of those foreclosures were in households of color. And so we saw an increase in the racial wealth gap after that. So due to the commodification of housing, where housing both homeownership, but also like investment in real estate has been seen as a good investment, like one of the best kinds of investments economically compared to many different industries. It's led to like social exclusion, segregation, wealth accumulation, all of that. And as wages stagnate, affordable housing remains elusive to most people, of course. Yeah, I've already said most of this, so I'm going to save my voice. But basically, community land trusts and other shared equity options prioritize use value rather than exchange value, as most like housing markets are emphasizing kind of the commodity of the home. I recently was part of a small research team affiliated with MIT CoLab, where we interviewed community land trusts as well as a real estate investment cooperative about different strategies for transformative land ownership. And I'm going to summarize a few of our findings because it was a really fun report, and I felt very inspired by these other organizations. So we saw community land trusts partnering with resistance movements, community land trusts supporting participatory neighborhood planning processes, and some creative community-based financing, and CLTs as part of a solidarity economy ecosystem. Community land trusts that have a lot of land have had significant land given to them from the city, often because of resistance and pushing for it. Most recently in Philadelphia, we saw occupations of houses owned by the city of Philly, where like they were squatting in response to the COVID crisis. And that led to the city directly transferring 50 city-owned vacant homes to the community land trust. That was amazing. Nothing like that has really happened before. It was kind of inspired by an occupation that happened in Oakland earlier before the pandemic, where Moms for Housing was occupying a vacant home that was owned by a real estate investment company. And they were able to win both some legal push for kind of policy changes around affordable housing, as well as that investment company started negotiating with the community land trust, and the community land trust bought it. So both of these would be a little bit hard in Madison, just because our community land trust wouldn't be able to buy a house at market rate without city support anyway. And because in the Philly situation, the city of Philadelphia had a lot of vacant homes, and city of Madison does not have just vacant homes. This point is near and dear to my heart, because we're working on this land use planning group with the NPC to try to think about a rubric for what kind of development do we want to see, how do we evaluate developments. And I think we could kind of grow into visualizing kind of neighborhood map of the north side of what do we even want to see here. And this is something that several community land trusts have done to working with neighborhood groups to visualize proactive plans for what the community wants to see. All three of these, I'm pretty familiar with the staff and organizers involved in them, and I'm just so inspired by what they're doing. So in Toronto, there's the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, which focuses on one neighborhood that's seeing a lot of new development, and they've partnered with the university and other neighborhood groups to do a lot of really intense planning sessions several years ago. And so now they have this legit looking plan. And sometimes when developments come up and the people in the neighborhood want to resist, they can pull out this plan and say no, look at this lot. This is not what people said they wanted here. And so they've actually succeeded in getting some things denied and some other ideas come through city council through that kind of advocacy. And Chinatown Community Land Trust in Boston has also collaborated on these sorts of plans. And the Bronx Community Land Trust is working through some of this process right now. The Bronx Community Land Trust is exciting too, because they're part of a bigger push for a solidarity economy ecosystem. So the Bronx Cooperative Development Initiative, BCDI, they have a whole kind of vision and infrastructure building like program for how to get especially big institutions like hospitals and universities to buy from local businesses owned by people of color, as well as cooperative worker co-ops. And so that's their procurement initiative. And they're like negotiating now on some of that big deals to really get local investment in local institutions that are really run by the people. Because, you know, a lot of hospitals and universities will buy the cheapest thing they can find, which might come from out of state or, you know, really bad labor practices at some big, you know, Amazon or whatever. So that's one of their big initiatives. And as part of that, they want to develop worker co-ops, and they want to be able to own the land under places where they want to develop worker co-ops, and they want to support affordable housing and housing cooperative development. So last year, they started a community land trust to acquire land as part of that ecosystem. And they've been doing all of this community planning, like in the last slide, to help people visualize what they want to see. And they've actually talked about daycare co-ops, which is something that the Northside Planning Council is talking about too, which is exciting. And I know they're kind of doing part of their first like negotiation for their first big housing or mixed use project is happening right now. And one kind of similar thing, maybe a smaller scale, there are a few community land trusts that have specifically focused or done development in the commercial sector. So they have identified a need for affordable commercial space in areas that are gentrifying. And one of these was in St. Paul at Rondo Community Land Trust. And I actually did my dissertation work on this project. So there was a neighborhood group of Black business owners in this historically Black neighborhood, the Rondo neighborhood, that they've been meeting for a long time and doing lots of things for a long time. But they both advocated for improvements to their street, and including things like this bike rack on the top, as well as working with the Community Land Trust to support the development of these two big mixed use developments that just opened last year to support Black entrepreneurs at affordable rates, as well as affordable housing on the top couple floors. So this was one like cool, hopeful story. It actually broke ground, and it's actually happening, you know, right now. And then last, this gets at that question of community investment trust sort of things. So this report that I helped write, I had like a whole section on community investment cooperatives or organizations. So I could actually talk about that for a whole hour, and it feels like I'm going to try to be succinct, but I now know a whole lot about it. But one of the biggest kind of organizations in this field that's doing a lot of really cool work and inspiring is the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op. And so they operate pretty differently from a nonprofit community land trust, because while they do take grants and they have some income that's just like free money, their main focus is getting like members to invest some of their money in a way that might give them a higher rate of return than a savings account, but still be like a slow growth, working at the speed of trust is one of the things they talk about. So they might get a small return on their investment in a way that can still make sure that the developments that come out of it are affordable for the community, but that people living there have the most say on what happens there, not just the investors getting to decide what happens there. So they've thought out this whole kind of system to make it as equitable as possible, but still to allow everyday people to invest something in the project, whether it's just $50 or $100. They have a whole kind of points of unity agreement that investors have to sign, and every investor is like a member who has a voting share, but they have different categories of membership. So people who live in the areas that are being gentrified, especially people of color, have like a kind of greater say in a lot of things that happen with the money. And then again, investors can choose to get, I think it's between 0 and 1.5% of like a rate of return on their investment. So some people just decide to park their money there and not get any rate of return at all because it's the right thing to do. And then there's other initiatives kind of in this realm. The Boston Ujima project has a community fund, and the New York City Real Estate Investment Co-op has very similar goals, that they haven't had any projects yet. Yeah. If you have more questions, let me know, or I can brainstorm outside of this about this whole thing. But it takes a lot of groundwork to start something like this, and the structure you would choose to do it will depend on the state. And thankfully, Wisconsin does have cooperative laws that make it easy to do something like this. So I would be totally game to like work on something like this at some point, by the way.
That's right. We were on that phone call with them and learned a lot about that. Lori's asking the city state that they're in San Francisco, right?
Oakland, yeah.
Oh, Oakland, right, sure. Okay. And then Leslie was just commenting that it sounds a little like buying bonds from Willie Street when they've expanded.
Yeah, I would say it works in a very similar way, except that it's more of like a permanent investment where, well, that's not exactly true. So you have to work through securities law to do things that are, to make offers on shares that are for people who are not like millionaires. So if you're a millionaire, you're considered like an investor and you don't have to follow as many rules, basically. But if you're selling shares to kind of everyday people, there's like a lot of securities compliance stuff you have to do with a securities lawyer and all this stuff. And my point is, there's a whole lot of different ways that even East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op, they're already working on like 3 different types of share offers that might have different rates of return, or it might allow you to live in a different state and invest, but some of them might be restricted to California residents and stuff like that. So there's like all these different kinds of rules for different types. But yeah, a bond is like a security, I believe. But their whole structure is to do that kind of stuff like all the time, rather than it just being like the one-time bond.
Sure. Yeah. Andy had a question over at Facebook. How do you get folks at 30% county median income or less into land trust homes?
Great question. And that's one of the challenges with community land trusts is we're very well positioned to meet the needs of like median income homeowners, especially. But for the lower income people who like really need housing, every nonprofit is facing the same problem, which is it's really hard to find the money to subsidize a house enough to bring the value down enough to make it affordable. for someone. And so community land trusts can develop rental housing or partner with someone else to develop rental housing, but we're still going to run into that same question of where do we get the money to make it affordable enough. And so that could, we could compile money from a bunch of different sources. We are actually partnering with Regenerate Housing Co-op. So we're going to own that housing cooperative, which will have some units that are rental and below 30% AMI. And we got some funds through the affordable housing program of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago to make that project possible. But I would like to do other types of rental housing as well that might be less hippie, if you want to say that. I lived in a co-op before. It's not for everybody.
Thanks, Olivia.
Yeah. I love that question though. And really if we do rental housing, community land trusts are not really that different from any other kind of nonprofit in terms of what we can offer, what we can do, and we face a lot of the same challenges. Yeah, so this is my last slide. So it's basically, if we want to expand the community land trust, which is my interest as staff of the community land trust, we have to really advocate for it because we want to make sure that the city knows that we want permanently affordable land on the north side or any part of Madison. Though we've always kind of focused on the north side in our history, and so we are kind of reinvesting in that space right now. But the biggest community land trusts have had direct property transfers of surplus and land banked land from cities, as well as from anchor institutions like hospitals or universities or churches that might have extra land. I've also been brainstorming about ways to do like a mass campaign to to get people to sell their home into the land trust and sell it below market rate to us to like keep it in the land trust forever. Yeah, and talk to me if you have other cool ideas. And I'm here for questions.
I think we've covered most of the questions as we've gone. I'm just going to check Facebook quickly and see if I see anything there. Nope. So we have about 5 minutes if anyone has any other questions that they'd like to ask, and anyone on the Zoom call is welcome to just unmute and also ask it themselves. Let's see. I don't see anybody. Marcia did ask if your slides would be available.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind. I can put the link in the chat if that helps.
Did you put together like some of the maps that you showed and stuff? Did you create those for this, or where did you find those?
All the maps were in the equitable development guide or report. So the city staff, I think, did a lot of that GIS work, which is amazing.
Yeah, that's great.
Some of the pictures I took, or my colleague that worked on that report with me took. So, I guess there's some, I don't really care though.
Great. Well, any other last questions? Lori has a question. I wonder about pursuing legacy donations to create a land trust. Many nonprofits seem to focus on that now, like Madison Community Foundation, well, as a foundation. Is that something that folks have, or as a community land trust, Olivia, is that something you've looked at?
I am stuck on what the term legacy donations is.
I think it's like when somebody leaves you land, like in their will, like
okay,
after they pass. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually got at least one house or an assortment of like land for 3 houses that way. And I'm definitely interested in doing more of that if people want to donate land. But I'm not sure about you know, making the right connections to do more of that. I'm still learning.
Here's a question. Is MACLT interested in agricultural land?
We have Troy Farm that's operated by Rooted, and the Troy Community Gardens. I wouldn't say we're uninterested, and I think we're interested. It's at this time, it seems like housing is such a hot issue and topic that like weighing those, you know, if you have a limited amount of land, I'm interested in making room for both, I guess, is how I would frame it. And I've actually had these interesting brainstorms with a couple people about like buying houses next to each other or like one behind another and having like, you know, farm or garden space in between them. That kind of stuff is like actually pretty interesting to me. So I think there's, you know, potential to do lots of different kinds of things.
Great. It looks like there's a question here. Curious about if there's any information regarding rural agrarian land trust to provide housing, food production, and to regenerate depleted farmland. And John Peck replied that Agrarian Trust is doing some great work on that. Wondering if you know of them or others.
Yeah, I think the Agrarian Trust is set up like almost like the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Co-op, like for kind of investor groups or people. I am definitely interested in how they're working. I know I think it's the Iroquois Valley Agricultural Trust or Real Estate Investment Trust. They focus on agricultural land.
Anything locally?
I don't think so.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions for Olivia? Well, thank you all for tuning in. Olivia, this was awesome. Thanks. We filled up the time really nicely. A lot of substantive information there. I really appreciated, you know, you spent some time defining gentrification, but then you really talked about a lot of the tools and did some really good assessment of the different tools available, because I think that's often where I hear the conversation come to an end is like, yes, gentrification is happening, and, you know, but I appreciate the way you evaluated all those different responses to it. So any last things you want to say before we sign off?
Thanks for all being here and listening to me. I think my parents even made it, which is like a fun thing about doing an online lecture and very cute. And this is fun for me because I used to teach urban geography, and I actually like dug into some old gentrification lectures from 5 years ago that I haven't thought about in a while, and that was fun. So I appreciate doing this. It was good for me too.
Great. Well, you got a lot of thank yous on Facebook, so you should go check that out later too.
Cool.
All right. Well, everybody have a great night, and stay tuned. We're going to be continuing this series on land use issues and inviting other guest speakers. Probably the next one will be in January, so we'll get that out to everyone. So take care. Have a good night, everyone. Thanks, Olivia.
Bye.
Bye. See you tomorrow.